We could spend an entire seminar on this single point. I've heard it mentioned by virtually every speaker in different words, phrases. It's so pervasive within our society, within our profession, and yet oftentimes when I hear it and I start querying people a little bit about it, I find out that, like the egg, no one has explained to them how to take it out of the shell. They've got the concept or parts of the concept, but they don't have what's necessary to actually make it work for them. And as a result, it isn't working for them. The concept I'm talking about here, which is one of the 7 strategies that needs to be put together like a recipe, is that of personal development. Personal development. Now, I'm going to define personal development from my vantage point first. You may have a different way of looking at this, but this is just the way I see personal development. Personal development, and I don't have a microphone that'll move, which is okay, but personal development says, I see myself over here, for example. This is my family, this is my finances, my fitness, my fun, social, cultural, spiritual, whatever's going on in my life, this is where I am. And without people pointing fingers at me saying you should be thinner or healthier or fitter or more financially stable or you should be doing more, without people pointing fingers, what am I saying to me? What am I saying about where I see myself in the areas of life that are important? And if I'm comfortable, fantastic. To the degree that you're comfortable is to the degree you don't need much, or I guess we could almost argue any personal development in that area. But if you're over here and you see yourself one day being over here, then the difference between those two, whether it's a small gap or a crack or a cavern or a chasm, whatever that is, that difference between those two is where personal development comes in. Because obviously, if you knew what you needed to know, if you'd embrace the techniques, the habits, the principles, if the practices, whatever it is, you'd already be over here. Does that make sense? I mean, for example, it only takes about, I would say 10 years to become wealthy in America. So if you've lived here for 10 years and you're not wealthy, then what we know statistically is if you're okay where you are economically, fantastic. Look, if you said to me, my ultimate goal is to be with my family and just to provide a living, I don't care about money, the only thing that matters to me is time with my children, then I'm not interested in your income any more than you're interested in your income. But if you're over here saying, I can't support my family, I can't take care of my family, I can't provide for my family, I need more for my family, or I want to be able to provide more for my family, and that's you saying that, and you've been at whatever it is that you're doing for more than 10 years and you're still struggling, we have a disconnect between what you say you want and where you ultimately would like to be. Does that make sense? Personal development needs to come in. So here comes the snag. Every year, there are approximately 50,000 new books that enter the marketplace in the United States. 50,000. Most of them, of course, are fiction, but you'd be amazed at how many of them come out on the subjects of money, finances, investing, etc. I mean, incredible books. Too many. So no one knows what to do. So most of us go from reading one book, Richest Man in Babylon. We pick up another book, Millionaire Next Door. We pick up another book, The Millionaire Mind. We pick up Susie Orman's book, Courage to be Rich. We pick up The Wealthy Barber. We pick up Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Cash Flow Quadrant. And I could go on and on and on and on and on with all the books that are out there in the marketplace that people have read and acquired. And yet if you asked someone, hey, tell me about this particular book. What do you think about that strategy? Oh, I love that book. Fantastic book. Really. What do you remember about it? What have you implemented? You begin to see the challenge? I'll give you an example. Am I the only person here that's heard of the book Think and Grow Rich? No. Okay, a couple of you? 4 or 5? 7? Maybe 10? Okay, a whole bunch? Okay. According to the story, Napoleon Hill went to work for a man named Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie at his time was the wealthiest man in the world. Back before the United States had invented an income tax, he was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Someone did the numbers one time and said if you equated the dollars, he would have been about 6 to 8 times wealthier than Bill Gates today. Now, I don't know if the math is accurate or not, but for his generation, he was a very wealthy man. He left us with Carnegie Hall in New York, the incredible Performing Arts Center. He started the library system throughout the United States. People have gone to school through Carnegie University, and on it goes, what he's done with his money. Because he had a very interesting two-part goal. The first was to spend the first half of his life making all the money that he possibly could. But the second was an interesting part to that whole concept, was to spend the second half of his life giving all that money away, which is exactly what he did. Now, Carnegie commissioned this young reporter named Napoleon Hill to take what he had learned and what indeed other people had learned about success and comprise that into what Carnegie called a philosophy, to publish it and share it with the world. The original writings of that were called the Laws of Success. The Laws of Success were originally released in, I think, the early 20s. The Laws of Success were about what this man, Napoleon Hill, had uncovered studying about 100 of the wealthiest men in his generation. People like the Wrigleys of Wrigley chewing gum fame, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison. The list goes on and on with the people that he had a chance to interview. Very interesting people. Here's what he found, and let me see if I can make my point. If you've read that book at least one time all the way through, please put your hands in the air. I'm not going to pick on anybody, just stick them way up so people can see. If you've read the book at least one time all the way through. Okay. He spends 20 years of his life studying the 100 wealthiest people and finds out they only have 13 things in common. 13. If your hand was in the air, could you grab right now pencil and paper and write down those 13 things? And if the answer is probably not, then what I will tell you that I know about personal development, the disconnect for me, what I've observed around the world, is we're spending too little time on too much material, when the reverse should be the truth. We need to start spending more time on less material. If you learn 3 words of Japanese and you leave the language, and you go on to learn Russian, and you learn a handful of sentences in Russian and you leave the language, and you go on to learn Portuguese and you learn a handful of expressions in Portuguese, and you move on to Spanish and you learn a handful there, of what benefit or good are you for anyone anywhere in the world? I mean, I can say goodbye in about 25 different languages. How does that help me? Because in all those languages, they can always, all of them know how to say it in English. What's the point? We need to spend more time on less material. I'm not suggesting you go get Think and Grow Rich. I'm not going to suggest from this platform that you spend time studying that book. What I am going to suggest is that if you felt the need to go get that book, and if you actually were interested enough to read it all the way through, and you liked what you read, then you owe it to yourself to read it until you know those 13 points and are implementing those 13 points into your life. Let's move on to another book. I really want to make this point. How to Win Friends and Influence People by Carnegie. Not Andrew Carnegie, Dale Carnegie. Here's a guy who studies people, and I think 1934 comes out with this classic. How many of you have read that book at least one time through? Okay, more hands. Fantastic. He found there were only 6 things that we need to do to get people to know us, like us, and trust us. I've referred to this on conference calls and in my writings as the most powerful personal development book when it comes to prospecting within network marketing that's ever been written. Master those 6 things and implement them at every turn, and you'll find people they'll just warm up to you. Instantly know you, like you, and trust you. So if your hand is in the air and I handed out pencil and paper and said there's only a half a dozen things, 6 is not a very big number, write down in order the half dozen things that Carnegie found through his studies that you need to do to create Know Me, Like Me, and Trust Me, those 6 things. How many of you feel you could just absolutely nail it? How many of you wanted to go get the book and maybe review it one more time? You get the idea. One last strategy. Money. You think you got it there? Little cheat sheet? Yeah, there's actually a section called 6 Ways to Make People Like You in that book. Very interesting. One last strategy. The Richest Man in Babylon. How many of you have ever read the book? Okay. How many of you know how many strategies there even are? There are 7. Of the 7 strategies, again, pencil and paper being handed out, you've read the book. How many of the 7 could you write down that you've immediately implemented? I was in a home in Bend, Oregon a few years back, and the family that had invited me out to do an event there, and when it was all said and done, we went and kind of had a very private, quiet, contemplative conversation. He invited us over to his home. We sat down, and he said, you can probably tell by looking around, my wife and I are struggling economically. I mean, we put on a pretty good front, but we're struggling. And you could tell by his home, he was telling the truth. He was a man who was revered within his company. He was the leader in that particular community. Most people, I think, thought he was doing much better than he was. He was struggling. And he said, Michael, with all the books you've read, if there's only one book you could recommend that I go get and read that would help turn my finances around, what would it be? And I said to him, The Richest Man in Babylon. I'll remember the rest of my life what he said next. I've already read that book. What else do you recommend? I said it as tactfully as I could. I did ask permission earlier on to tell you the truth as I saw it. Here's what I said to that fine young man on that particular day. What else would I recommend you read? Here's what else I would recommend you read. I would recommend you read it again. That's what I would recommend, until it becomes a part of the very fabric of who you are. Most people that read that book recognize if they implemented those 7 strategies in about a half a dozen years or less, they would be wealthy. Most people who read that book get excited. But like I mentioned early on about the habit, most people who close the cover of that book go on to get Kiyosaki's book or whatever else is out there in the marketplace, and they go from one book to the next book to the next book to the next book to the next book, and they have no idea, and their finances do not improve. It's one thing to make $100,000 a month in this business. It's another thing to make $100,000 a month and be poor. I know people that make over $100,000 a month, and I would classify these people as poor. You know why? They're 1, maybe 2 paychecks away. Company has a little hiccup, something goes wrong, little challenge like we've got going on in Japan, big challenge like in Japan. I mean, something that they couldn't have predicted happens to them, they're in serious trouble because they found a unique way to spend every single penny they have. They're living like on about $120,000 a month. They're only earning $100,000. You think, how could that be possible? The same way a person makes $25,000, $30,000 a year and lives on $15,000, $20,000 more. Used to be in America, it was easy. You know, the equity in the home would just rise, 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 rise until you maxed out every card you had. Then you just refinance everything and start over again. And we watched this cycle, did we not? Perpetuate and perpetuate and to perpetuate until all of a sudden the bank said, we're done. Then people went, but I'm not finished spending. Now what? Personal development. Here's the strategies I'm asking you to implement. Strategy number 1, read for 30 minutes every day. Pick a book by its title that would suggest it could help. Pick a book by its title that would suggest it could help. People say, what do you mean? I'm not advocating Dr. Phil's new book, but I'm trying to make a point. Dr. Phil wrote a book called Phenomenal Families. That's a book by its title that would suggest it could help if you were having a challenge within your family. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, that's what I mean. Find a title. John Kalinch, before he passed, wrote a book called 17 Secrets of the Master Prospector, specifically for the network marketing industry. That's a book by its title that would suggest it could help. I wrote a little booklet called 7 Prospecting Secrets. That's a little booklet by its title would suggest it would help. Does that make sense? Just look for the titles that would suggest they could help. But when you find those classic gems, instead of finishing one and moving on to the next, and then finishing that and going on to the next, finishing that and going on to the next, where someone comes to you and says, what were the principles, what were the points, what did you implement? And you got no idea. Spend more time on less material. There's only about a half a dozen books I think you really need to take your business to over 7 figures per year. Over a half a dozen books. But those half a dozen books need to be read and reread and reread and reread and reread and reread until someone comes up to you and says, Think and Grow Rich, 13 points. You say you want them forward, backwards, you want them alphabetical, well, how do you want them? You know the material that well, you're going to be a rock star in this particular business. No kidding. Okay? Personal development. Read for 30 minutes every day. Point number 2, listen to something that's been recorded for at least 30 minutes to an hour every day. Let that material just pour over you. It's what we call environmental immersion. It's the way every person here learned their mother tongue. Clean slate at birth. If we'd moved you to China, you'd speak beautiful Chinese, wherever you ended up, with no accent, if we moved you at birth. If we move you at our age today, we can learn the language, no problem. But sometimes it's difficult to get all the words right. Sometimes people can tell we're a foreigner, unless we move there and immerse ourselves in the environment. Environmental immersion is huge. To the degree that you want to learn 2, 3, 4, 5 languages, let me give you the best I've got. It would serve you well if you had been raised in a family where they spoke 2, 3, 4, 5 languages, because you would speak all of them today fluently without ever having to have broken a sweat. Agreed? Anybody here know what I'm talking about, speaks more than one language? Parents spoke one, English, outside or inside, whatever it was, you grew up? And we have friends very good friends of ours that are back home, Japanese. Only Japanese in the home, only English outside the house. Kids can look at you and they can tell by how you look which language to address you in. It's really interesting. You want to freak them out, talk to them in Japanese. They're like, because they know it's wrong. Guy like me starts speaking Japanese to them, they know, the little kid knows, that's fundamentally something's wrong there, something's wrong. Interesting. Read 30 minutes every day, listen for 30 minutes every day. Number 4, take 4 classes every year. 1 class every quarter. If Brian Tracy comes through your community, go. If you're interested in Tony Robbins, you like what he has to teach, go. If you don't, look for someone else. Look for the people that can help you. One of the rock stars in your company comes through, go. Bring your whole team there. But look for the people that can help you grow your business. First of all, it's a great place to meet people. You go to those events because you bring together like-minded people. I'll tell you, if Brian Tracy ever comes to your community, you'll find some of the best prospects for your business inside that seminar than you will probably ever find anywhere else, because you've got individuals looking to find a way to do better in their lives. But 4 classes every year. Make sure at least 2 of those come from within your own company and 2 from outside. And it's the combination of that over time that will make all the difference.